Good morning, children. The next topic of the lesson, the outbreak of revolution. From the same lesson, French Revolution, the second topic is outbreak of revolution. So we already learned that when Louis XVI came to power, the country had an empty treasury. An increased taxation was the only alternative to overcome this crisis. But the king did not have power to impose taxes at his own will. For that, a meeting of the Estates General had to be called, which had to pass his proposal of taxes. Proposal for new taxes. The king could suggest that taxation is the only way by which we can overcome the financial crisis, but he could not do it by himself. For that he needed the permission from the Estates General, which was a political body of France which included representatives from all the three estates, 1, 2 and 3. So, in that meeting, the king will propose his idea of taxation, new taxes, how and what he wanted to introduce, and these members of the three estates that together form the Estates General will have to pass his proposal. The king could decide the date for the meeting, and after 175 years in French history, on May 5, 1789, an assembly of the Estates General was called to pass proposal for new taxes, where in the most splendid hall of the Versailles Palace. In the beginning we learned this was a very magnificent palace, very huge, and maintaining it was a big burden, financial burden. So in the splendid hall, in the very beautiful hall of Versailles Palace, a meeting of the Estates General was convened on, or was to happen on 5th May 1789 to decide upon the new taxes to be introduced. The hall was all set and ready for the meeting. The representatives, 300 members each from Estate 1 and Estate 2, arrived, and they were given seats right in front facing each other on both the sides, while 600 members of the third estate had to stand behind them, even though they were represented, that is the third estate were represented by the rich and educated among them. The peasants and the women were denied entry. See the discrimination there too we can see. The first members of the first two estates, 300 of them had come, they were given seats in front. Whereas the 600 members who represented the third estate were not given seats but asked to stand behind the members of the first two estates. The proposal was put forward by the king, and now it was time to vote. As usual, the king decided to continue with the traditional principle that each estate had one vote. So, all the members, they did not vote. So, they decide, and the king, as usual, he decided to continue with the traditional principle that each estate had one vote. But members of the third estate disagreed to this. What made them do that? Disagree to the proposal or to how the voting was to be conducted. They were inspired by the works of the social thinkers. Mainly, the social thinker Rousseau, who made them aware of the democratic principle of equality. And with that in mind, they asked the king that voting should be conducted for the assembly as a whole and each member should be given one vote. The king knew what would happen. So they rejected, the king rejected, and the members of the third estate, they walked out of the hall in protest. What must have made them so confidently say that we are against the traditional way of conducting vote, we want it to change? Remember, the third estate constituted about 90% of the total population, and they were the only taxpayers. And so they considered them as representatives of the whole nation. The nation is moving forward because of them, and they constitute about 90% of the total population. They are more in number and they are the taxpayers. They are the ones who financially support the country. On 20th June 1789, the members of the third estate gathered in the hall of the indoor tennis court of Versailles Palace. So now they were unsatisfied and unhappy about what happened. So they were waiting for all chances they could get to make use of, to make sure that this monarchical rule comes to an end somehow. So on this date, June 20, 1789, they once again assembled in the hall, in the tennis court of the Palace of Versailles, and decided to have a national assembly for themselves and not to disperse until a constitution was drafted for France, which limited the powers of the monarch. So they were taking an oath at the tennis court of Versailles Palace. In the indoor tennis court of Versailles Palace, the third estate of the French society took an oath. That is why it is said tennis court oath. What was the oath? That a national assembly should be formed and they will not disperse from this tennis court until a constitution has been made for them, which will limit the powers of the monarch. So they were helped by two leaders, Mirabeau and Abbe Sieyès. Remember, Mirabeau is a member of the first estate. He belonged to the noble family. But still he was against the principle of feudal privileges. And he kept speaking to the common people, trying to make them understand and convince that this is not what should happen in our society. You should fight for equality and put an end to this feudal system. The second person, Abbe Sieyès, he was a priest, and he, through leaflets and pamphlets, made the people aware of the need to wipe out monarchy and feudal privileges, and spoke how powerful the third estate was in the French society, that this was possible by them, that you are very powerful, you are more in number, so there will be enough and more of good ideas that will come from you, and we will be there to help you. So fight for it. Bring an end to the monarchical rule and the feudal system. So they were inspired by yet another pair of people, Mirabeau and Abbe Sieyès, who also spoke against the monarchical rule and feudal privileges. So, in the tennis court of the Versailles Palace, the drafting of the constitution was going on. So they had decided not to disperse, not to move out of the tennis court until the constitution was completed. So they were there. So while the National Assembly was drafting the constitution, a severe winter struck the nation, which meant bad harvest. Bad climate, poor yield. So what will happen when there is bad harvest? What will happen? There will be rise in price of bread. There will be rise in price of bread. So it became difficult for the people to get enough food. So they forcefully entered shops and grabbed all what they could get from them. So now everything is in a confusion. So to impose law and order, the king ordered his troops to move into Paris. Angered by this, the crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastille. That is what I began with. This is the first incident that happened in France while people were revolting or protesting against the harsh rule and policies of Louis XVI. And this happened on 14th July, and to add to the shame that has happened to the king's rule, it is said that it was totally destroyed and pieces of it was sold in the market. People bought it to keep it as a souvenir for them, to keep reminding them of the bad days they had once upon a time in their own country. At the same time, what was happening? Rumors spread in villages that the Lord of Manor, who is this Lord of Manor? The official tax collector, with the king's army, were about to destroy their ripe crops. Caught by the great fear of the loss of their livelihood. That is what that is sustaining them, keeping them, helping them to have something to eat, sell it, the surplus, and earn something. So out of the great fear of the loss of their livelihood, they had nothing else but only their agricultural tools. They ran, got hold of them, and went and attacked the Chauseo, the official residence of the Lord of Manor, where they burned all documents that they could catch hold of that was related or that had something and anything written about tax payments. And also, they took away all the hoarded grains. What do you mean by hoarded grains? Hoarded grains is for them, the nobles or the 1 and 2 estates, the king and his family. Food grains they had already stored and kept ready. They will have no problems. All what was stored there was taken away by these third estate members, the peasants. Now, the nobles were forced to leave their homes, and many of them fled to the neighboring countries. Things were becoming more and more difficult for the higher class people of the society. Unmatched by the power of his subjects, Louis XVI is slowly trying to accept the people. He agreed to recognize the National Assembly and that his powers could be checked by the Constitution. So, he recognized National Assembly and he allowed them to control him by the drafted Constitution. So, on August 4, 1789, another important day in French history, August 4, 1789. On August 4, 1789, the National Assembly passed a law. What was that law? The law was to abolish. What all was to be abolished? What all was to be abolished? The feudal system, the taxation policy. the privileges that were granted to the members of the first and the second estates, the clergy mainly. The taxes like tithes were abolished. Land that was owned by the church was taken away. And by this, the government got assets worth about 2 billion livres, with which they repaid their loans. So, the estates, third estate people were so determined that they somehow want to get rid of the monarchical rule and the feudal system that was causing a great deal of trouble and problems for them. So, their determination and decision to have a constitution for the country and a national assembly to rule over them was slowly showing positive signs. So, on this day, August 4, 1789, they passed a law abolishing the feudal system, taxation policy, asking the clergies to give up their privileges, abolishing tithe, ownership of the land was taken away from the church, and they got a good amount. Maybe they sold the land and they collected about 2 billion livres, which is the currency, and they were able to repay their loans. Now France is on its way to become a constitutional monarchy. So they are only limiting the powers. They did not say they will completely throw away the king's rule. So by the constitution, what have they done? They limited the powers of the monarch. So a constitutional monarchy was slowly coming into place in France. In 1791, the National Assembly, with its completed constitution, limiting the powers of the monarch and instead powers shared among the different political institutions, the organs, which are those, the legislature, executive and the judiciary, introduced a new political system for France. The absolute right of the monarch was taken away. The harsh rule or the harsh policies of the king will no more exist. The feudal lords, the nobles, were not in power anymore. It was the National Assembly and the Constitution that had authority. So now France has become a constitutional monarchy. And in 1791, the National Assembly, with its completed constitution, limited the powers of the monarch, and they introduced a new political system by giving power to the three organs, the legislature, the executive and the judiciary. The indirectly elected National Assembly had the power to make laws. But all people of France was not even then given voting rights. Men above 25 years and all those who could pay taxes equal to 3 wages of a laborer could vote. And they were called active citizens. They were called active citizens who were the voters above 25 years and above 25 years, and they were able to pay tax equivalent to 3 days of a laborer's wage. The rest of the men and the women were considered as passive citizens. They did not have voting rights. Also, only those who could pay higher amount or higher taxes could qualify as members of the assembly. The constitution granted fundamental rights to citizens. Fundamental rights to citizens like freedom of speech, equality before law, right to life and freedom of opinion. These were the fundamental rights. What were the fundamental rights? Freedoms of speech. Freedom of speech. Then what is the next one I said? Equality. Equality before law. Equality. Then Then what was the next one I said? Right to life. Right to life. Right to life and freedom of opinion. And freedom of opinion. And freedom of opinion. And these fundamental rights granted to people, these fundamental rights, freedom of speech, equality before law, right to life, freedom of opinion, these fundamental rights given to citizens were called as natural rights. They were also called as inalienable rights. They could not be taken away from the citizens. It belonged to them by birth. And these natural rights had to be protected by the state. They have to make sure, the government has to make sure that the citizens are allowed to enjoy these fundamental rights in the French society, in France. Now, since many of the French people were unable to read and write, the content of the Declaration of Rights, these fundamental rights were declared to them. So, the Declaration of Fundamental Rights was conveyed to the people using symbols like law tablet, then bundle of rods, broken chain, the national colors of France, blue, white and red. So, fundamental rights, speech, equality before law, right to life, freedom of opinion was declared and given to the people of France, and this was made known to the public. This should be known to even those who are unable to read or write. So, that was done using symbols like the law tablet, the broken chain, the bundle of rods, RODS rods, and the national colors of France, red, blue and white. So, now France is a constitutional monarchy. French people can enjoy quite a few fundamental rights. Many more were added to the voters list. So, slowly there are changes happening in the social structure of France and also the political system of France, which was what the French people wanted. Still, political tensions were there in France and it took many more years for this to subside. So, it kept on happening. So, one by one the people are gaining what they wanted, but still everything was not complete for them. So, there were tensions in France even now, even though it has become a constitutional monarchy, and it took many more years for that to subside. So, that brings us to the end of the second topic, the outbreak of revolution. Hope you have understood the outbreak of revolution. Is it clear? We learned about the Estates General, the importance of the Estates General. What happened when the Estates General was called for a meeting, and what did this incident lead to? The third estate estate members becoming more determined, and they deciding to have a national assembly and a constitution. The king slowly recognized this and agreed his powers to be limited, and France became a constitutional monarchy in 1791. And natural rights or fundamental rights were granted to people of France. Understood? Yes.